Monica Carter had devoted 22 years to building one of the company's most successful divisions, and everyone who worked beside her knew it. She trained managers who later ran entire departments, solved crises that seemed impossible before lunchtime, and quietly sacrificed promotions of her own just to keep the business steady through hard years. Then, during a flashy modernization meeting dressed up with new branding and bright slides, executives announced they were replacing her with someone half her age, praising fresh energy while walking Monica out of the building that same afternoon. They believed experience could be summarized in a handout and downloaded into a stranger's confidence within a week. 3 months later, their biggest client walked away, key projects collapsed one after another, and the board faced a crisis no slide deck could fix. Suddenly, the same executives who had erased Monica's career from the org chart were standing outside her front door, asking politely for the one thing money could never manufacture overnight. What happened between that humiliating afternoon and the day they came looking for her again would become the story employees whispered about for years. A story about what happens when a company mistakes confidence for competence and youth for value. Long before any of that happened, Monica arrived at the office earlier than anyone else, usually before the sun had fully cleared the parking garage across the street. She liked the quiet of those early mornings, the hum of the building waking up around her, the sense that she had already solved half the day's problems before most people had poured their first cup of coffee. Employees on every floor knew her name, not because she demanded attention, but because she had earned a kind of respect that did not need to be requested. Junior staff came to her office with tangled spreadsheets and half-finished proposals, and somehow she always found the one detail that made everything click into place. When a shipment went missing overseas, when a vendor threatened to walk, when a system crashed 2 hours before a major presentation, people did not panic and call the executive suite first. They called Monica. Clients trusted her in a way that went beyond ordinary business politeness. Sterling Manufacturing, the company's largest account, and the one that generated nearly a third of annual revenue, had worked almost exclusively through Monica for over a decade. Their procurement director once said, only half joking, that he would rather negotiate with an empty chair than with anyone else on the team, because Monica remembered details no one else bothered to track. She remembered which factory line had struggled the previous winter, which shipment had been delayed by a storm 2 years earlier, and which promises had been made and needed to be honored precisely. The chief executive, a man named Gregory Simmons, often introduced her to visiting partners with a kind of practiced pride, telling them that if Monica Carter ever decided to leave, the whole division would be in serious trouble. He said it so often that people in the office began to repeat it themselves, half as a joke and half as a quiet truth everyone accepted without argument. There was nothing flashy about the way Monica worked, and that, in its own way, was exactly the point. She did not chase attention in meetings or perform confidence for an audience. She simply arrived prepared, spoke only when she had something worth saying, and left every room a little more organized than she found it. New hires were often surprised by how calm she seemed even during the worst weeks of the fiscal year, when deadlines piled up and tempers grew short around her. She would look at a spreadsheet full of red numbers, take a slow breath, and start working through the problem line by line, as though panic were simply an inefficient use of time. People who worked under her for even a single project often said the same thing afterward, that they learned more from watching her handle a crisis than they had learned in years of formal training elsewhere. By the time she reached her early 40s, Monica had become something close to institutional memory for the company, a living record of every decision that had shaped the division over 2 decades. She knew why certain policies existed, which mistakes had led to which safeguards, and which shortcuts had been tried and quietly abandoned after painful lessons. Younger employees sometimes rolled their eyes when she cautioned against repeating an old error, not realizing that her caution had been purchased at the cost of real failures she had lived through herself. Still, even those employees came around eventually, because her instincts were rarely wrong, and when they proved wrong, she was the first to admit it and correct course without excuses. The company's success, quiet and steady year after year, rested more heavily on her shoulders than most people in the executive suite ever fully acknowledged, though everyone below that suite understood it perfectly well. There was a particular kind of trust Monica had earned that could not be written into any job description, the trust that comes from years of consistent behavior under pressure. When budgets tightened and layoffs loomed in other departments, employees in Monica's division felt a strange sense of security, not because she promised anything, but because her steady presence made the uncertainty feel manageable. She had a habit of walking the floor once every afternoon, not to supervise or inspect, but simply to check in, to ask how a project was progressing, or whether someone needed help untangling a problem before it grew larger. Those small gestures, repeated for over 20 years, built a kind of loyalty that no bonus structure or team-building retreat could ever replicate. People stayed at the company, some of them, specifically because Monica was there, and everyone quietly understood that her departure, should it ever happen, would change something fundamental about the place they worked. By the time the world around the company began to change, Monica had built something that felt permanent, a reputation so solid that even the newest hires assumed she would always be there. What none of them realized was that permanence, in a company driven increasingly by shareholders and spreadsheets, was never guaranteed to anyone, no matter how many years they had given or how many crises they had quietly resolved. The stability she represented was about to be tested in a way she never expected. The trouble began, as it often does, with a phone call from people who had never set foot on the operations floor. A private investment fund called Whitmore Capital had purchased a significant stake in the company, and with that stake came a seat on the board and a set of expectations that had little patience for slow, steady growth. The fund's representatives spoke in a different language than the one Monica had spent 22 years learning, a language built around quarterly returns, brand perception, and what they like to call modernization. Gregory Simmons, who had once praised Monica so openly, found himself under pressure from people who did not care about the decade of trust she had built with Sterling Manufacturing. They cared about optics, about headlines, about the kind of energy that photographed well in an annual report. Within weeks, the conversations in the executive suite shifted from strategy to image. Whitmore Capital's representatives suggested, gently at first and then less gently, that the company needed a younger, more dynamic face to attract new investors and younger clients entering the market. They spoke of trimming what they called legacy overhead, a phrase that sounded harmless in a boardroom presentation, but meant something very different to the people whose names sat quietly beneath it. Gregory, never a man built for confrontation, found it easier to nod along than to defend the very people who had kept the company afloat through years he barely remembered surviving. He told himself it was simply business, the kind of necessary evolution every company eventually faced, and he avoided thinking too closely about who exactly would pay the price for that evolution. Around that same time, a new hire joined the division, a young man named Tyler Brooks, fresh from a prestigious business program and already skilled at the kind of polished self-presentation that impressed people who valued confidence over substance. Tyler was intelligent in his own way, quick with numbers and quicker with a well-rehearsed pitch, and he understood instinctively how to make a room feel excited about an idea even before that idea had been tested against reality. He had almost no real experience managing a crisis, had never negotiated with an angry vendor at midnight, and had certainly never spent a holiday weekend rebuilding a supply chain that had collapsed without warning. None of that seemed to matter in the rooms where decisions were made. Executives loved him instantly, the way people often love a promise before they have seen it kept. Monica noticed the shift long before anyone said a word to her directly. She noticed how meetings that once included her from the start now happened without her, how certain conversations paused slightly when she walked into a room, how Gregory's easy warmth toward her had cooled into something more careful and distant. She said nothing at first, choosing instead to watch and gather information the way she always had, trusting that patience would eventually reveal the truth. But somewhere beneath her calm exterior, a quiet unease had begun to settle in, the kind of feeling that comes from 22 years of reading rooms correctly and sensing, without needing proof, that something important was about to change. The announcement came during a company-wide meeting held in the largest conference room the building offered, the kind of room usually reserved for major client presentations rather than internal staff gatherings. Employees filed in expecting updates on quarterly performance, some checking their phones, others quietly speculating about what warranted such a formal setting. Gregory Simmons stood at the front with a confidence that felt slightly rehearsed, flanked by two representatives from Whitmore Capital, who watched the room the way investors watch a stock ticker, calculating rather than feeling. When Gregory finally spoke, his voice carried the practiced enthusiasm of someone delivering news he had convinced himself was good. He said the company was entering an exciting new chapter, one built on fresh energy and forward-thinking leadership, and then he gestured toward Tyler Brooks standing near the front, calling him the future of the division. A ripple moved through the room, quiet but unmistakable, the kind of silence that happens when people sense something is wrong, but are unsure whether they are allowed to react. Monica sat near the back, her expression unreadable, though those who knew her well could see something shift behind her eyes. Before the meeting had even fully ended, she received a message asking her to step into a private office down the hall. There, an HR representative named Karen Ellis, visibly uncomfortable, explained that Monica's position had been eliminated as part of the company's restructuring, and that due to the transition, she would not be needed for an extended handover period. Effective immediately, her employment with the company was over, and she was expected to collect her belongings before the end of the day. Not a single person in that room raised an objection, not because they did not care, but because fear has a way of silencing even the most loyal employees when livelihoods are on the line. Monica listened to the explanation without interrupting, her hands folded calmly in her lap, absorbing 22 years of dismissal delivered in barely 5 minutes. When Karen finished speaking, clearly bracing for anger or tears, Monica simply nodded once and said, quietly and without bitterness, that she understood. She rose from her chair, walked back to her office, and began placing her belongings into a single box, with the same steady efficiency she had brought to every crisis she had ever solved. She did not cry, and she did not raise her voice. She simply felt, more deeply than she let anyone see, an overwhelming sense of disappointment in people she had trusted for far too long. By the time Monica carried that box through the lobby and out into the afternoon sunlight, word had already spread quietly through every floor of the building. Some employees pretended not to notice her leaving, afraid that acknowledging her departure might somehow implicate them in whatever politics had caused it. Others watched from a distance, unable to look away, sensing that something important and irreplaceable was walking out the front door with her. Monica did not look back at the building as she crossed the parking lot, though many people inside were watching her retreat through the glass, wondering silently whether the company had just made a terrible mistake. In the days immediately following Monica's departure, the office tried to convince itself that everything would settle into a new, comfortable rhythm. Tyler Brooks moved into a newly renovated office, with a view that had once belonged to no one in particular, and Gregory Simmons made a point of praising him publicly at every opportunity, eager to prove to Whitmore Capital that the transition had been the right decision. For the first few weeks, the surface of the business looked calm enough, the kind of calm that comes not from stability, but from momentum built up over years by someone who was no longer there to maintain it. Existing contracts continued running on autopilot, built on relationships Monica had spent years cultivating, and no immediate disaster appeared to prove anyone wrong. Beneath that surface, however, small cracks began appearing almost immediately, the kind of cracks that only someone with real experience would have noticed and addressed before they widened. Tyler was skilled at presentations, but he struggled when clients asked pointed questions about production timelines or contingency planning, areas where Monica had always been able to answer instantly, drawing on years of hard-earned knowledge. He often deferred decisions to committees or delayed responses while researching answers that Monica would have known from memory, and those delays, though small individually, began to accumulate into a pattern that clients noticed. Sterling Manufacturing's procurement team, accustomed to immediate, confident answers, found themselves waiting days for responses that once arrived within hours. Politely at first, and then less politely, they began asking where Monica had gone. Internally, morale began eroding in ways that did not show up cleanly in any quarterly report. Employees who had relied on Monica's steady mentorship found themselves adrift under a manager who, however intelligent, lacked the instincts that only come from years of lived experience inside a company's unique rhythms. Several long-tenured staff members, quietly loyal to Monica and increasingly frustrated by the changes around them, began updating their resumes and accepting offers elsewhere. Each departure took with it not just a headcount number on a spreadsheet, but institutional knowledge that had never been properly documented, existing only in the minds of people who had learned it directly from Monica over the years. Costs began creeping upward as new hires needed extensive training, and schedules that once ran with quiet precision started slipping in ways that frustrated everyone downstream. Gregory Simmons noticed the shift, though he was slow to admit what it truly meant. He told himself the turbulence was simply the natural cost of transformation, the temporary friction that always accompanies meaningful change, and he repeated this explanation to Whitmore Capital's representatives whenever they raised concerns during monthly check-ins. Privately, though, doubt had begun to take root somewhere behind his composed exterior, a nagging sense that something essential had been lost in the rush toward modernization. He found himself, more than once, reaching for his phone to ask Monica a question out of old habit, only to remember, with an uncomfortable jolt, that she no longer worked there and had no obligation to answer, even if he called. The confidence he had displayed so proudly during the announcement meeting began to feel, week by week, more like performance than conviction. The crisis, when it finally arrived, did not creep in slowly. It arrived all at once, the way a dam breaks rather than leaks. Sterling Manufacturing, after months of mounting frustration with delayed communication and inconsistent decision-making, sent formal notice that they were terminating their contract at the end of the current cycle, citing a significant loss of confidence in the company's operational leadership. The announcement landed in the executive suite like a physical blow because Sterling's account alone represented nearly a third of the division's annual revenue, a relationship built over more than a decade of careful, patient trust that Monica had nurtured almost single-handedly. Losing that single client did not simply hurt the balance sheet. It sent a signal to every other partner watching from the sidelines that something had gone seriously wrong inside the company. Compounding the disaster, a major infrastructure project valued at tens of millions of dollars, one that Tyler Brooks had personally championed as proof of his forward-thinking vision, collapsed under the weight of poor planning and unrealistic timelines. Deadlines had been promised to investors without properly consulting the operational teams responsible for delivering them. And when reality failed to match the confident projections in Tyler's original pitch, the fallout was severe and immediate. Subcontractors walked away mid-project, penalty clauses activated automatically, and the financial losses rippled outward into departments that had nothing directly to do with the failed initiative. Around the same time, several key employees who had held the operation together through sheer institutional memory finally exhausted their patience and resigned, taking with them knowledge that no training manual had ever managed to capture. Departments that once cooperated smoothly under Monica's quiet coordination began turning against one another, each searching for someone else to blame, rather than admitting collective failure. Finance pointed at operations pointed at sales, and everyone quietly pointed, in hushed conversations away from open ears, at the decision that had removed Monica in the first place. The board of directors, growing increasingly alarmed by the mounting losses appearing in weekly reports, called an emergency meeting to demand explanations that Gregory Simmons struggled to provide with any real conviction. One board member, a sharp-eyed woman named Diane Whitfield, who had quietly opposed the original restructuring decision from the very beginning, finally said aloud what many in the room had been thinking for weeks but had been too afraid to voice. She stated plainly that the company had let go of exactly the wrong person, and that no amount of fresh energy could replace 22 years of earned expertise walking out the door in a single afternoon. The room fell silent after Diane's comment, the kind of silence that carries more weight than any argument could. Gregory Simmons sat with his hands folded on the table, staring at numbers that no longer made sense to him, numbers that told a story he had refused to see coming. For the first time since the restructuring announcement, he allowed himself to fully admit what part of him had suspected for weeks, that the confident, fresh face they had chosen over quiet experience had been, in the end, exactly the kind of decision that experience exists to prevent. Somewhere in the back of his mind, uninvited but persistent, Monica's name kept returning, along with an uncomfortable question he was not yet ready to ask aloud. Whitmore Capital's representatives, who had once pushed hardest for the modernization strategy, now sat quietly at the far end of the table, unwilling to defend a plan that had cost the company so dearly in such a short amount of time. Their earlier confidence about fresh branding and youthful leadership had evaporated the moment the losses became impossible to explain away in a quarterly report. One of them finally asked, in a tone far more subdued than the demands he had made months earlier, whether there was any way to undo the damage before the next shareholder meeting arrived. No one in the room had a satisfying answer, and the silence that followed made it clear that whatever solution existed would not come from another slide deck or another confident young hire. Tyler Brooks, for his part, had grown noticeably quieter in the weeks leading up to that meeting. The easy charm that once filled every room, now replaced by a visible strain he could not quite hide. He had never been given the mentorship or the runway that Monica herself had once received over her many years climbing through the company, and the weight of leading a division through crisis, without that foundation, had begun to show plainly on his face. Some employees, even those who resented how quickly he had been elevated above more experienced colleagues, found themselves feeling a strange kind of sympathy for him, recognizing that he too had been set up to fail by decisions made far above his own authority. It was not entirely his fault, and even Gregory, in his quieter moments, understood that the true failure belonged to the people who had promoted image over substance in the first place. While the company spiraled through crisis after crisis, Monica's own life had taken a very different shape, one built not around anxiety, but around a kind of steady, hard-earned peace she had not felt in years. In the first weeks after her departure, she allowed herself something she had rarely permitted during 2 decades of relentless dedication: simple, unhurried rest. She spent mornings reading, rather than answering emails before sunrise, took long walks through her neighborhood without checking her phone every few minutes, and rediscovered hobbies she had quietly set aside during years of 18-hour workdays. For the first time in longer than she could easily remember, her calendar belonged entirely to her, and she found that the silence, rather than feeling empty, felt like room to breathe. As the initial shock of her departure settled, Monica made a deliberate decision to invest in herself rather than immediately searching for another corporate position identical to the one she had lost. She enrolled in an advanced certification program focused on organizational strategy, sharpening skills she had already mastered through experience, but had never formally documented on paper. She approached the coursework with the same discipline she had once brought to crisis management, absorbing new frameworks and comparing them against decades of real-world lessons she carried in her memory. Instructors in the program quickly recognized that Monica brought something most students lacked: the ability to test theoretical models against the messy, unpredictable reality of running an actual business under pressure. Several classmates, themselves professionals from other industries, began seeking her advice outside of class, drawn to her calm, practical way of solving problems that textbooks tended to oversimplify. It did not take long before word of her expertise began traveling through professional circles far beyond her old company. A former colleague, now working at a mid-sized logistics firm, reached out asking if Monica would consider a short consulting engagement to help resolve a supply chain bottleneck that had been quietly bleeding money for months. She agreed cautiously, uncertain at first about stepping into consulting work, but within 2 weeks she had identified inefficiencies the firm's own internal team had overlooked for over a year. The results were immediate and measurable, and satisfied clients, as they often do, began recommending her name to others facing similar struggles. Within a few months, Monica found herself running a small but growing independent consultancy, choosing her own clients, setting her own rates, and working exclusively with companies that valued precisely the kind of deep, patient experience her former employer had so casually discarded. Financially, the consulting work proved more rewarding than her previous salary had ever been, freed from the constraints of a single employer's budget and internal politics. More importantly, though, Monica noticed a change in herself that mattered far more than any number on an invoice. She felt lighter, more confident, and increasingly aware that her years of dedication had built a reputation strong enough to stand entirely on its own, independent of any single company's name attached to her title. Late one evening, reviewing a new client proposal at her kitchen table, she realized with quiet clarity that she no longer needed the company that had once defined so much of her identity. She had built something new, something entirely her own, and for the first time in over 2 decades, that realization felt like freedom rather than loss. She also began mentoring younger professionals through a program she joined almost by accident, invited by a former colleague who thought her experience might benefit people just starting their careers. Monica found unexpected joy in those sessions, watching young women in particular light up when she explained how she had navigated difficult rooms full of people who underestimated her for reasons that had nothing to do with her ability. She never mentioned her former company by name during those talks, choosing instead to focus on principles rather than grievances, teaching patience, preparation, and the quiet power of simply being the most competent person in the room without needing to announce it. Several of her mentees later told her that those conversations had changed how they approached their own careers entirely, and Monica began to understand that her value had never been limited to a single job title in the first place. Friends who had watched her endure the humiliation of that final afternoon noticed the change in her almost immediately, remarking that she seemed years younger despite the difficulty of everything she had been through. She slept better, laughed more easily, and spoke about her work with an enthusiasm that had quietly disappeared sometime during her last few years at the company, buried beneath mounting pressure and thankless overtime. It was not that her old job had been without meaning, but rather that meaning, she came to realize, required mutual respect to survive, and respect was precisely what had been missing in those final months before her dismissal. The first call from her old company came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, an unfamiliar number flashing briefly on Monica's phone before she recognized the area code and let it go to voicemail without answering. It was Gregory Simmons, his voice careful and measured in the recorded message, asking if she might have a few minutes to talk about, as he put it, an important opportunity. Monica listened to the message twice, feeling no particular urge to call back immediately, and set the phone aside to finish the client report she had been working on when it rang. A second call came 2 days later, this time from Karen Ellis in Human Resources. Her tone noticeably warmer and more apologetic than it had been during their last conversation inside that small office months earlier. Monica let that call go unanswered as well, unwilling to rush toward a conversation she suspected would only matter if the other side truly meant what they were about to say. By the following week, the calls had escalated beyond individual executives reaching out on their own initiative. An email arrived directly from the board of directors, formally requesting a meeting at Monica's earliest convenience to discuss what the message described as a matter of significant importance to the company's future. Unlike the earlier calls, this message carried a different weight, a formality that suggested the request had been discussed and approved collectively rather than attempted quietly by a single desperate executive. Monica read the email twice, considering carefully what it might mean, and after several days of thought, she replied with a brief, professional message agreeing to a meeting, though she made clear it would happen on neutral ground rather than inside the building she had once called her professional home. They met at a quiet conference room in a downtown office building, unaffiliated with either party, a choice Monica had insisted upon deliberately. When she walked in, she found Gregory Simmons seated at the table alongside 2 board members, including Diane Whitfield, whose expression carried something closer to respect than the polite indifference Monica remembered from years of passing her in hallways. Gregory rose slightly as she entered, his usual polished composure noticeably absent, replaced by something more careful and uncertain. After a brief exchange of pleasantries that felt more like formality than genuine warmth, Gregory finally said the words that had brought them all together, that the company wanted Monica to come back, and that they were prepared to discuss whatever terms would make that possible. Monica did not respond immediately, allowing a long, deliberate silence to settle over the room before she finally spoke. She was not angry, and she made no move toward dramatic confrontation or bitter accusation, though everyone in that room clearly expected some version of both. Instead, she asked a single, quiet question that carried far more weight than any outburst could have managed, simply asking why. The question hung in the air for a long moment, and Gregory, visibly uncomfortable, began explaining haltingly what had happened since her departure: the lost client, the failed project, the resignations, the mounting losses that had finally forced the board to confront a truth they had avoided for months. Diane Whitfield, more direct than Gregory had managed to be, admitted plainly that the company had made a serious error in judgment, undervaluing decades of earned experience in favor of an image that ultimately proved hollow under real pressure. She acknowledged that losing Sterling Manufacturing had damaged not just revenue, but the company's broader reputation among other major clients who were now quietly reconsidering their own long-term relationships. Gregory added, with something that sounded almost like genuine regret, that the company had underestimated how much of its success depended on relationships and judgment that simply could not be replicated by confidence and charisma alone. Monica listened to each admission without interrupting, her expression calm and unreadable, absorbing every word with the same careful attention she had once brought to solving crises that others considered unsolvable. When she finally spoke again, it was not to accept their offer outright, nor was it to reject it out of lingering resentment. Instead, she began laying out conditions, calmly and precisely, the way she had once negotiated contracts worth millions of dollars during her years running the division. She made clear that she would not simply return to the same role under the same conditions that had allowed her dismissal to happen so easily in the first place. Any agreement, she explained, would need to include real decision-making authority, protected from the kind of sudden political pressure that had eliminated her position without warning or discussion. She was not interested in symbolic titles or vague promises of respect that could evaporate the moment a new investor demanded fresh optics. Gregory and the board members exchanged glances, clearly having anticipated some form of negotiation, but perhaps not one delivered with such calm, unshakable confidence. Monica continued, explaining that any employees who remained loyal to the company during the recent turmoil deserved protection from the same kind of careless restructuring that had cost her career overnight. She wanted guarantees, written clearly into any agreement, that decisions affecting operational leadership would never again be made purely to satisfy investor optics without proper consultation. It was not about revenge, and she made that distinction clear more than once during the conversation, watching their faces carefully as she spoke. It was about ensuring that whatever came next would be built on genuine respect rather than convenience. Respect that could not simply be withdrawn the moment circumstances shifted again. The board members left that first meeting with far more to consider than they had expected, and over the following days, Monica took time to think carefully about what she truly wanted from any potential arrangement. She spoke with a few trusted colleagues from her growing consulting network, weighing the appeal of stability against the freedom she had only recently discovered for herself. She thought about the 22 years she had already given to that company, about the ease with which they had discarded her, and about whether stepping back into the exact same structure would only recreate the same vulnerability all over again. Slowly, an idea began forming in her mind, one that felt more aligned with the person she had become since walking out of that building with a single cardboard box. She also thought about the employees still inside the company, the ones who had stayed loyal through months of chaos, watching projects fail and colleagues leave without any real power to change the direction things were heading. She remembered their faces from the hallways, the ones who used to bring her coffee during long nights before a major deadline, the ones who had learned patience and precision by simply watching how she handled pressure. Whatever she decided, she wanted her decision to protect them as much as it protected herself, because she understood better than anyone how quickly a company could turn on the very people who held it together. That thought, more than any financial incentive, shaped the proposal she eventually brought back to the table. Rather than returning as an employee bound to the same organizational chart that had once erased her position with a single decision, Monica proposed something entirely different when the board reconvened for a second meeting. She suggested that she return not as senior operations director, but as an independent executive transformation consultant, leading her own small team, brought in specifically to rebuild the division's operational foundation from the inside out. Under this arrangement, the company would not simply be rehiring one person, but investing in an entirely new structure designed to prevent the kind of fragile, personality-dependent leadership that had nearly destroyed them. Monica would maintain her independence, her existing clients, and full authority over how the transformation would be implemented, answerable only to results rather than internal politics. The proposal surprised everyone in the room, though Diane Whitfield, watching Monica closely, seemed to understand immediately why this arrangement made more sense than a simple return to her old title. Gregory Simmons hesitated only briefly before agreeing, perhaps finally understanding that true stability could not be purchased by trapping someone back into the same fragile position that had failed her before. The negotiations that followed moved more smoothly than anyone had anticipated, guided by Monica's clear, methodical approach to structuring an agreement that protected everyone involved, including the employees who had remained loyal through the company's most difficult months. By the end of that second meeting, both sides had reached terms that felt, for the first time in a long while, genuinely fair to everyone at the table. 1 year later, the company that had once stood on the edge of collapse looked almost unrecognizable, though the change had little to do with flashy branding or youthful energy alone. Under Monica's guidance, operational processes had been rebuilt from the ground up, documented carefully, so that critical knowledge no longer lived exclusively inside any single person's memory. Sterling Manufacturing, impressed by the company's genuine, demonstrated commitment to reliability, had quietly returned as a client, after months of careful relationship rebuilding led personally by Monica herself. New employees received structured mentorship, rather than being thrown into high-pressure roles without adequate support, a direct result of policies Monica had insisted upon during her negotiations. Revenue had not only recovered, but had grown steadily beyond its previous levels, built this time on a foundation designed to withstand pressure rather than crumble beneath it. At the company's annual gathering, held in the same large conference room where Monica had once been quietly dismissed, Gregory Simmons stood before the full staff to deliver remarks very different from the ones he had given a year earlier. His voice carried none of the rehearsed enthusiasm from that earlier announcement, replaced instead by a quiet, genuine humility that surprised many longtime employees who remembered his earlier confidence all too well. He admitted plainly, in front of everyone gathered, that the company had once believed youth alone could replace experience, and that this belief had nearly cost them everything they had spent decades building. He acknowledged, without excuses or deflection, that the lesson had been expensive, painful, and entirely necessary for the company to finally understand what truly mattered. When Gregory finished speaking, he invited Monica to the front of the room, and she walked forward with the same steady composure that had defined her throughout every chapter of this long, difficult journey. She looked out across the room at faces both familiar and new, employees who had watched her walk out with a single box a year earlier and who now watched her return not as a returning employee, but as someone who had reshaped the very foundation they now stood on. She spoke without notes, her voice calm and measured, carrying the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone in that room. She reminded everyone gathered that value should never be measured by how young or exciting someone appears in a single meeting, but by the depth of judgment they carry through years of navigating real, difficult challenges. She told them plainly that experience was never meant to stand in opposition to innovation, but rather to serve as its foundation, the steady ground upon which real, lasting change could actually be built. Without that foundation, she explained, innovation collapses under its own weight the moment real pressure arrives, exactly as the company itself had painfully discovered. She did not mention her own dismissal directly, nor did she dwell on the mistakes that had led everyone to that room, choosing instead to focus entirely on what the company had learned and how it could carry that lesson forward. There was no bitterness in her voice, no lingering resentment aimed at anyone who had wronged her, only the quiet, hard-won clarity of someone who had rebuilt her own worth entirely on her own terms. She spoke, too, about the young employees now working under her mentorship, several of whom had joined her transformation team after the restructuring, including, to the surprise of many in the room, Tyler Brooks himself. Rather than pushing him out entirely once she returned, Monica had chosen to bring him onto her team in a smaller, better-suited role, one that allowed him to grow under proper guidance, rather than being discarded the way she once had been. She believed, and said so plainly that day, that people deserved the chance to develop into their roles, rather than being thrown into positions they were never properly prepared for. Tyler, standing quietly near the back of the room, listened to those words with visible gratitude, understanding perhaps for the first time what real mentorship looked like compared to the empty confidence he had once been asked to perform. As she finished speaking and the room rose into applause, Monica did not need public vindication to know what she had accomplished, because she had already proven it to herself long before that day arrived. She had not sought revenge against the people who dismissed her so carelessly, nor had she humiliated anyone who had once underestimated her value. She had simply continued being exactly who she always was, patient, capable, and unwavering, allowing her own steady competence to speak louder than any apology ever could. In the end, her greatest victory was not the applause filling that conference room, but the quiet, unshakable self-respect she had carried with her every single day since walking out that door, long before anyone ever thought to ask her to come back. Years later, people who had witnessed that entire chapter of the company's history still spoke of it as a turning point, not just for Monica, but for how the company understood the true source of its own success. New employees heard the story during their earliest weeks on the job, passed along not as gossip, but as a kind of quiet lesson about what genuine value looks like when tested under real pressure. Monica herself rarely brought it up, unless directly asked, preferring instead to focus on the work in front of her, still arriving earlier than almost anyone else, still solving problems calmly while others scrambled around her. She had proven, in the end, that 22 years of dedication could not be erased by a single afternoon of poor judgment, and that true worth, however long ignored, has a way of eventually being recognized by those wise enough to see it.